Hey, party people, good afternoon and welcome to today's CAFETA webinar, live on October 24th. For those who don't already know, CAFETA means learning in Creek. In that respect, today we'll be learning about internal controls under NAHASDA from Vince Franco. My name is Brooke Warrington. I'm the Training and Development Specialist here at the Native Learning Center, and we're also thrilled that you could join us here today. Please follow along as I read the disclaimer aloud. This webinar provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable. We also have our copyright infringement law. This is just a friendly reminder that the webinar presentation materials are protected by copyright, trademark, trade secret, and other intellectual property laws. Before we get started, I want to familiarize you with some of the features available and how the environment works. If you look at the top of your screen, you'll see an icon of either a person with their hand raised or just a hand. With that icon, you can either raise your hand, agree, disagree, or step away. Now your screen should look similar to this graphic here. To the bottom left, you'll see a box that says Files. Here you'll find a copy of today's presentation. Feel free to download a copy for yourself. Simply click the item you'd like to download, then click the arrow pointing downwards to save it onto your device. The second box is labeled Web Links. This is where you'll find our survey about today's webinar, along with the link to join our email list and any other links that'll be seen throughout today's presentation. Finally, to the right of the screen, we have a chat box available. This is how you'll communicate with the instructor and the NLC staff. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to interact by using the chat box. Just type your message and hit enter, or click the up arrow button icon to submit. We do encourage class participation, so please feel free to write in those questions or comments. Any tech support issues could also be submitted here. Know that most of them can be solved by just exiting and re-entering the meeting room. But let's go ahead and try out the chat box together by typing in your name, where you're joining us from, and your tribal affiliation, please. All right, folks, with that, it is with great pleasure that I introduce today's webinar instructor, Vince Franco. And Vince, I will hand it off to you now.
Thank you very much, Brooke. Hey, hello, everybody. Welcome. As Brooke had mentioned, please not only enter into the chat box your tribal affiliation, where you're from, and if you think of it, what you're looking to gain from this. I'm very much interested to make sure that during the discussion today I touch on areas of concern for you, if you have any. If there are no particular areas of concern, then I'll just approach this as I usually do, and just move forward with it. So please, if you have any particular area, keep in mind that the name of it is Fundamentals of Internal Controls under NAHASDA, the NAHASDA legislation, which includes, of course, the approval of the Indian Housing Block Grant, which I know a lot of the organizations, tribal entities, tribal nonprofits that are in attendance today, tribally determined housing entities, TDHEs, are under the umbrella of NAHASDA in the Indian Housing Block Grant. But really, internal controls are part of the regulations. So no matter what entity you are, you could be a tribal entity, you could be an institution of higher education, as they like to refer to it, IHE, Institution of Higher Education. You could be a medical facility. You could be a nonprofit, or a lot of different things. Keep in mind that the federal regulations, if you receive a federal grant, the federal regulations applies to all those industries, including tribal entities, including TDHEs. And thank you, everyone, so far for indicating. I see so interested to see if my TDHE is in line with NAHASDA. Good, but you're in the right place. We're going to be talking about that, Nancy. And other, that's kind of the focus of what it is. Internal controls under NAHASDA, under the Indian Housing Block Grant. So that's the focus. But like I said, the regulations, including internal controls, are very broad in scope. Any entity receiving federal funds is going to be under the umbrella of internal controls. It's one of the things you're going to have to do. Now, part of this presentation, I'll be talking about some proposed changes to the federal regulations. I'm not sure if you all know this, but the Office of Management and Budget, referred to as OMB, is AKA the White House, basically, has put out what's called proposals to update the uniform guidance. Part of the uniform guidance, that's the federal regulations, 2 CFR Part 200, and internal controls is part of that. So as we go through this presentation, I'm going to be talking about the regulations that are in place right now, especially for internal controls. And I'll also be talking about some of them that are subject potentially for change. Right now, those proposal for updated changes to the uniform guidance, including internal controls, are in a 60-day window comment period. So we really won't know. I have an idea here. I've read through the proposal. I have a good idea what they're talking about, where the proposals are, and the degree of difficulty, so to speak, just how complicated they are. And, my educated guess as to if they'll really come through as a proposed change. And we won't see that until December of this year, maybe January at the latest, maybe even February of next year. But I want to give you the heads up to look for, because some things are changing under the internal controls. Some of the thresholds and some of the criteria is going to change. So wanted to point that out to you, and that's what we'll be doing. So thank you, everyone, Nancy and Stacy and everyone, Joyce and Susan and Cora, Bliss and Tina, etc. I hope I didn't miss anyone, Nancy, for indicating the tribes and the housing entities, TDAGs, and where you're from and any concerns you might have. And as we're moving along, if you have any comments or concerns, please put them in the chat box. I'll keep an eye on that. I know Brooke will also keep an eye on it as well. And if I miss something, she'll bring it to my attention. But I will try to address everything in real time instead of waiting to the end. Unless it's super complicated, and then we'll probably have to deal with that after the presentation, perhaps. And as Webb said, and as Brooke said, in the middle of your screen, you should see a series of web links, 11 of them to be exact. Now, 9 of them pertain to the actual presentation, and I want to point those out to you. There's a lot of valuable resources and links there in those web links. You're also going to see them as we progress along in the QR codes that are embedded into the presentation. And two of the web links of the 11, 2 of them pertain directly to the Native Learning Center. One is a survey you're going to see at the end of the presentation. And the other one, quite frankly, is their brand new weekly newsletter, which is very, very awesome. It's really good. Good information about upcoming training programs and what's happening from the Native Learning Center's perspective within Indian country. And I recommend that you sign up for it and you get that newsletter on a regular basis, because it's very, very informative. Brand new, very, very colorful, very informative, and I highly suggest it. Okay. So let's move along here. Brooke, I'm going to ask you to put up the first survey, and you're welcome. Put up this first survey, if you would. I'd like everyone to take a look at this. And it's a question on if your tribal organization, TDHE or whatever, nonprofit, whatever, is the recipient of federal grant funds. Do you have an internal control system that meets a requirement and is mandated in the uniform guidance as it currently exists? Give you a minute to take a look at that. Those of you that said yes, good, okay. And those of you, a fair amount of you that said, I think so, that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. So I think it would behoove you, you're almost half of the group, you think you have internal controls. This is the time to know what's important within the internal control. So after this program, you can literally check to see if you do have them and to what extent do you have internal controls that meet the requirements, not just of NAHASDA, but also of the Indian Housing Block Grant if you receive it, at a minimum, to make sure that you meet the federal requirements. That's what we're going to be doing for the next, close to an hour and a half here, plus or minus. Okay. So let's get right into it. That's a little bit about me. Agenda, you know about the course. That's what we're talking about. The objectives are pretty much the same. Here's the agenda. We're going to kind of split it in half. First half, we're going to refer to the actual regulations and issues pertaining to what's called internal controls. All right. I'll give you some resources to look at, including some QR codes. A little more definition on the proposed changes that I was talking about to the uniform guidance. Also, what are internal controls and some of the compliance concerns. By the way, I served nearly 12 years with the Native Learning Center as their compliance director. So when it comes to compliance and compliance protocols and issues, that's kind of my thing, kind of my bread and butter. So I'm going to be focusing on that. And then the second half of the program is talking about the policies and procedures, which really are where the internal controls are put into motion in your policies and in your procedures. Okay, so we'll make the distinction between internal controls, which are kind of the big picture mechanisms that you should have in place to control the three most important aspects of your entity, of your program. And that is the operation, number one. Number two would be the financial activities. And number three would be the compliance protocols. Those three things are the pillars, so to speak, of internal controls. They are put in place on a daily basis by the policies and procedures that you should have in place that have the detail of how to actually do it, do whatever it is you need to do. So that's where we're going to be focusing on. You gave me an idea where you are. Half the group knows that they have internal controls. The other half, not quite sure. So that's kind of puts me right in the middle. From a facilitator standpoint, I'm kind of right in the middle here in my presentation here in my delivery, knowing that some of you have probably pretty good knowledge of your internal controls. And like one person said, you want to see if you're up to speed, up to date with, what's required and what NAHASDA is saying, or even more importantly, what the federal regulations are saying, because they had a tendency to change more frequently than the legislation does. And for others of you, this might be new or relatively new information. So bear with me as I'm trying to give you a lot of information in a very short period of time. I also want you to know to just take a step back and relax, take a deep breath, because a lot of this information, it's going to be hard to take it all in a 90-minute time frame, less now than 90 minutes. But you might have a question 3 hours from now, a day from now, a week, a month from now. You can always reach out to the Native Learning Center if you have a specific question, or directly to me. Either way, the message will get to me, and I'll do my best to help you with anything you might have related to the not just internal controls and policies and procedures, but understanding the federal regulations, because it's a big task trying to stay on top of changing the regulations alone, let alone the changing regulations rolling out soon, and the difference between existing and new. All right, that is my email address. Just post it to the chat box. nextventureconsult@gmail.com is mine. If you want to go directly to me at any time, I suggest you link on that, or write it down or whatever, so you have it. You can send subsequent questions or concerns to me, or you can go directly to Brooke at the Native Learning Center, and she will forward them to me. Either way, I will make sure Brooke is in the link so the Native Learning Center knows we're, trying to troubleshoot something, working on something. Part one, the importance of internal controls. I'm going to throw some resources at you. Some you might be familiar with, others might be new. Well, let's take a look. 3 on this screenshot here to start with. Let's look over at the far left, what's referred to as the Green Book. If you've never heard of the Green Book before, that is the government, OMB, Office of Management and Budget's manual on internal controls for federal governments. So if you want to really kind of dig deep and get a little better understanding on a bigger picture level, on kind of a global level, where internal controls come and how the federal government looks at them and why they're so important to the feds, I recommend that you use the QR code or just Google the OMB's Green Books. There's the full name, Standards for Internal Controls in the Federal Government. It's a rather large document, a little difficult to navigate through, but you know, if you wish to dig deep and have a little base of understanding why all the federal agencies are obligated to follow internal controls, then knock yourself out. It's a good read, but it's very in depth and it's good. And the one in the center, what are the internal controls in the HUD exchange? So in this QR code, you're going to HUD directly. So those of you that receive the Indian Housing Block Grant, may want to use this if you haven't already. Go to HUD, go to the exchange. There's the link, website link. Thank you, Brooke, for posting that in the chat box to take you to HUD. That's another resource to look at it from HUD's perspective. And that's good to know if you're a recipient of Indian Housing Block Grant, right? Definitely. And at the far right is the federal regulations right now. It's a link, I don't think that goes directly to the full regulations. It goes to, or should, 2 CFR Part 200-303, which is the citation within the uniform guidance. In fact, I'm going to pull up my smartphone and just make sure that link indeed, it's my understanding it does, but let's look in real time. My smartphone is taking me to, okay, it is taking me to the Code of Federal Regulations, but the federal regulations. If you want to drill down a little more, we will talk about this in a little more detail. You can even Google this, 2 CFR Part 200.303. And if you do that, it's going to take you to the specific citation, the requirements for internal controls. And that's something we have to abide by. And here's the rub. When you go to this site and you look at 2 CFR Part 303, you're not going to see very much. It's one of those regulations that is vaguely written. Thank you, federal government. There's not much there. In some of the other citations, there's a lot of detail. They tell you exactly what to do. But when it comes to internal controls, they do not give you a lot of guidance. What does that mean? It means that we have to have a certain level of comfort as recipients of federal funding. We've got to have a certain level of comfort and understanding to know how to navigate through the internal controls and through the Indian Housing Block Grant and through NAHASDA, all the different levels that pertain to our funding. We've got to have a level of comfort to know that we can navigate and, more importantly, interpret what those regulations mean currently and proposed, so that we can put policies and procedures in place that are, with a reasonable amount of assurance, that they are up to date with the federal regulations and what's happening right now, and that they even more importantly, that those regulations fit your program. That's the interpretation part, to be able to take these nebulous, open-ended regulations like 2 CFR Part 200 internal controls and make them fit, so that, as you know, fit your organization. That's the important thing. All right, so 3 QR codes there, and here's a little bit more. Here's another one. Back to HUD, ONAP specifically, and ONAP's talk here about monitoring, self-monitoring, and the self-monitoring checklist. Self-monitoring is a whole discussion in itself. I had that presentation last week, Tuesday, on internal controls. Self-monitoring is one of the internal controls. It's something we have to do. I really hope that you were with me last week when I talked about it. If you weren't, don't panic. You can go to the Native Learning Center, go to the Catheda online link on their homepage, and go to the self-monitoring. I would suggest that you download it and watch it and listen to it, because self-monitoring is a very important part of your internal controls. So enough on that. There's the QR code. That's the description. And there's a little bit of information from HUD there in the screenshot on self-monitoring, which is, like I said, one of the internal controls. Now, here's another one that I want you to take a real close look at. Here's the QR code for it. This is a link, a QR code link to the updates of the uniform guidance. If you have not seen it, I would suggest that you go to it and use the QR code, or you can Google it if you wish. There's a couple ways to get there. You can go to the whitehouse.gov. You can go to that website, and then once you get there, you Google, or you enter in the search box that they have updates to the uniform guidance, and it'll take you to that document. Or you could use this QR code to do it. But either way, I would suggest that you go and look at the proposed internal controls. I've already done that. If you send me an email, thank you again, Brooke, for posting that. If you send me an email, or Brooke, I can send you my interpretation of the updates, not just the White House or OMB's announcement, but my interpretation of it. I've gone through it. It's hundreds of pages long, because remember, uniform guidance applies to all the different industries, not just tribal. So it's like a 450-page document, plus or minus. You have to know how to navigate through it to find 2 CFR Part 200. That section is buried within the updates. I found it, I looked at it, I analyzed it, and I created my interpretation of the updates. I have a single document. If you'd like to see it, that's fine. Otherwise, just listen, and as I go through, I'll point out some of these changes that might happen. Okay. All right. Hopefully, we're good so far. Sorry, this control is a trigger finger thing. So fast. Okay. And the last one I want to share with you, the last QR code for the moment, is this one on the GEMS program. Those of you may or may not know this. Those of you that receive Indian Housing Block Grant funds, you know that you have to do what's called the Indian Housing, the IHP at the beginning of the year, Indian Housing Program, and at the end of the year, you have the APR. Those two programs, Annual Performance Report, those two programs over the years have changed. The reporting process has gone from Word document to Excel sheet to the EPIC program, which was in place up to about not even a month ago. And now we have what's called the GEMS program, which was rolled out by ONAP, HUD's ONAP office, literally less than a month ago, with a very short turnaround time for those reports to now be the IHP and the APR, now to be submitted through the online GEMS system. So there's the QR code for it. There's the screenshot explaining the GEMS program. You can also go directly to HUD, and then you could enter in GEMS in their website, and it'll take you to the same place. I would suggest you strongly look at it, because they've got new deadlines set up for those reports through that system. So I wanted to share that with you too. Okay. Any questions so far on some of these resources and opportunities? If not, we'll get into it. Importance of internal controls. What are internal controls? Yeah, so fast. What are internal controls? They are a series of aggregate policies and procedures to protect the program, basically, to protect the tribe, to protect the assets of the organization from being lost, stolen, or used for personal gain. And I have to stop here because this statement may sound kind of open-ended and kind of funny. You know, what are internal controls, their protections, and all that kind of stuff. I have to share with you the fact, and you'll see this in the proposed updates to the uniform guidance, that the federal government's concern for identity theft and fraud and mismanagement of data is out of control. They are very, very, cybersecurity is another one. They are very concerned about all of these issues. And more, even transitioning from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, I thought a lot of these regulations would loosen up. They have not. They have, if anything, they've tightened up in a lot of different areas. There are some that have loosened up. Most of them are more restrictive than before. And that's because of this burning issue of identity theft, cyber security, cyber theft. I mean, almost every a week goes by, right, that we don't hear about some kind of data breach, right, from a lot of these big companies that are out there, the big ones, you know, the nationwide and global industries, the ones that you would never thought would be hacked, you know, the Walmarts and Las Vegas, all of the, not all of them, but a huge block of casinos, security theft, I mean, ransomware and all that. So if anything, what we're seeing is a trickle-down effect of more and more policies and procedures being put in front of us for the most part. But we still have the issue of policies that are vaguely written, internal controls, but through the uniform guidance that are difficult to interpret. So that's where we need help, right? To make sure we're doing what we need to do, like it says here, to protect the program against theft, against just misappropriation or misuse of funds, intentional or unintentional. That's what we're, to the best of our ability, with reasonable control. What are internal controls? There's a series of them. I talked about them before. The big ones are operational, financial, and compliance. So a couple things here on this page. What are internal controls? Finance, effectiveness, and efficiency. Now with finance, we, a lot of us, of course, fall back on what's referred to as generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP protocols, GAAP protocols. That is clearly stated in the federal guidelines, and you can look it up yourself, 2 CFR Part 200, 302. The name of it is financial management. It is a requirement. It's one of the major internal controls. You should have a series of policies and procedures in your organization that support all the different financial transactions and activities under the umbrella of financial management. So what would that be? Things like cash management, things, anytime we have transition of funds or use of funds or finance, then we need to have policies and procedures in place. The screenshot on the right is the actual citation, 2 CFR Part 200. Now, as you look at that, let me point something out to you. It says Code of Federal Regulations at the top, but this is not your grandparents' Code of Federal Regulations. If you've ever seen the real Code of Federal Regulations, it's written like a newspaper. It's in columns, vertical columns, very, very small print, very difficult to read, almost nearly impossible to navigate on screen because you got to go from the left to the right, down, up and down different columns, and it's very difficult to navigate. I usually go to a website called eCFR, and E as in electronic, ecfr.gov, to get a more user-friendly, readable version of the uniform guidance, of all the federal regulations, including the uniform guidance. It's written, as you can see in the screenshot there, it's written in Yeah, that's the link there to ecfr.gov. Thank you. And that'll take you to the home page. And keep in mind, from there, you're going to have to select the uniform guidance, 2 CFR Part 200. But I'll tell you what, it'll be worth your time because you'll be able to download and print, if you wish to, a much more easier, user-friendly version of the federal regulations. It's written more. Nothing's missing. It's the same information as the traditional Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, but it's more in a user format. Okay, that's. I just wanted to point that out to you so you can see it and know what I'm talking about, because I go to it all the time. I have it downloaded, I have it printed, and I would strongly suggest that you do it. And that is one document, the 2 CFR Part 200, from beginning to end, that you become familiar with. Because not only are your internal controls mentioned in there in what's called Subpart D. Subpart D, there's 6 subparts, A, B, C, and D. Internal controls are listed. The 2 CFR Part 200 303 is found right above the beginning of Subpart D. All the information is in there. Everything is in there. And I recommend that you do read that so you can be up to speed. Okay. The next one I want to point out for internal controls, another very important one, and this is the program I did last week, self-monitoring. Self-monitoring is required in the NAHASDA legislation. They call it monitoring. It's also required in HUD's requirements for Indian housing, Native American housing. Now, their requirements, you may want to write this down, are in addition to the Uniform Guidance 2 CFR Part 200, HUD also has what's called Native American Housing Activity Guidelines, 24 CFR Part 1000. In there, it's all self-monitoring and internal controls are mentioned, required, and also, of course, in the Uniform Guidance, which is what we're talking about today, 2 CFR Part 200 303. But monitoring, I did that last week, self-monitoring, a program dedicated just to self-monitoring. Very, very important. The nice thing about it is, even though it's required to do, you have to do it at least annually. I suggest that you do self-monitoring as part of your internal controls much more frequently than just annual. You know, the letter of the law says that you're supposed to do the self-monitoring once a year and include it, a written version, and include it with your APR, your annual performance report, as an additional document, and you send that in to your EWONAP office. I would suggest that you do that much more frequently than once a year, so that you can use it for what it's designed to do. What is it self-monitoring designed to do? To look for discrepancies in your program, to look for system failures before it becomes official. And that's why I recommend doing it semi-annually or even quarterly, to find, while you're doing it internally, to find out where your discrepancies are, to mitigate them. And then, so when you do have to submit the self-monitoring report on an annual basis, which is required, then it's a pristine report. If you only do it annually, you're not going to be, if you find something, you're just simply not going to have time to make the corrections, right? So self-monitoring is required. There it is in black, well, in red and black. 2 CFR Part 200 329, monitoring and reporting program performance. This is becoming more and more of an issue. Not just the importance of monitoring, the importance of reporting, but more and more data-driven reporting. More and more, we're seeing that. That is why the reports moved from Word documents to Excel sheets to the EPIC system to the GEM system, because more and more data-driven requirements are being mandated to the federal agencies across the board. They, in turn, are passing those requirements more and more to us as recipients of federal funding. So this is an issue that's going to grow in complexity. It's not going to be reduced. It'll be more intense. Monitoring, data-driven satisfaction, data gathering. You're going to see all of that intensify over the months and years to come. So this is the time to get a handle on self-monitoring as part of your internal controls and do it correctly and follow the guidelines that are said right here in 200.329. Reach out to me if you're looking for more information on best practices, for example. What are they doing at other tribes? How's it working for them? Or what other resources are there to supplement, to make our job easier, to structure our self-monitoring so it's less painless for us to do. I can help you there. Okay. What are internal controls? Here's the third area, compliance, the protocols and the oversight. Compliance overlaps into everything. So you've got to have good compliance protocols as part of your internal controls, right? Here's just an example where I have a little bit of discrepancy with what's stated in the federal regulations. Internal controls as if you meet the letter of the law, the uniform guidance, 2 CFR Part 200.334 talks about retention requirements of records. And in there, if you read it, really the most significant thing is, if you look at it, it talks about the protection of records and you got to submit them. We know all that. But the thing that stands out is a 3-year retention period. 3 years is what the uniform guidance says. And personally, from my experience, 12 years in doing compliance with a tribal entity, I'm going to tell you, I think that's not enough time. Even the IRS says 7 years for keeping important financial records. So I suggest that you meet the letter of the law and keep them for 3 years, but you consider a longer period of time. And the reason being is more and more ONAP and HUD and some of these other federal agencies, like most industries, are struggling to get people on board. So what the gist of that is, their program review schedule is become, I don't want to say less of a priority, but it's harder for them to do it. But the requirement is still there, to retain records and then have program reviews from time to time, and et cetera. But it doesn't always happen that way. Practical matter is it doesn't happen that way. And you never know when they're going to come in, someone's going to come in and ask for records that go beyond the 3-year period, both hard copy and electronic, if you're doing both, or either one actually. So you want to keep those records longer than the 3-year period. So that's one area that I disagree with. Not disagree, but I suggest you go further with it, that you have something that is just more restrictive than longer than a 3-year period. Compliance with applicable laws. This gets into what the feds could do if you don't have internal controls, which is pretty ugly. We can get into all kinds of restrictions, suspensions, and loss of funding, and even worse. So you don't want to go into this area. You want to do everything you can do, and I like to use their terms, with reasonable assurance that you are doing the best you could do. And that is their phrase, reasonable assurance, that you're doing everything with your internal controls to cover operations, financial activities, and compliance, and have subsequent policies and procedures in place. Right. And like anything else, warning here, they're only as good as internal controls are only as good as the enforcement that you put in place. Hopefully you don't have to put the policeman's hat on too frequently to enforce policies and procedures. Hopefully you don't have to put the compliance director's hat on to use internal controls as leverage to persuade leadership or colleagues or others that for one reason or another hesitate to follow the rules, you hate to put on the compliance director's hat, and as one of my colleagues used to say, drop the hammer. But that's exactly what compliance can do. That's kind of the dark side of compliance, is using it as leverage to make sure, if you have to, to make sure that operations, processes, and people in some cases are doing what they're supposed to do, even if you have to force them for their own benefit. That is the empowerment and the leverage and the power of compliance done right. Most of the time, hopefully things are running smoothly. People understand the process and why we have internal controls, but every once in a while, you've got to put on the police officer / compliance director's hat and force something to, force the change from time to time. You can only do that if you are empowered to do it and if you understand the internal controls that you're trying to enforce. That's why you're here today, or at least part of the reason, right, that you're here today, to learn these things. All right, a couple concerns about compliance issues. I kind of alluded to them. Compliance issues, fraud is one of them that's become more and more of an issue. And because of that, we're seeing more and more internal controls being brought down on us or forced upon us by our agencies and by the uniform guidance to tighten things up. Even if it's unintentional. Well, fraud is hard to be unintentional. But misappropriation of funds or things like that, that could be unintentional, But fraud is fraud, and it's illegal, but it's rampant. You've heard of white collar fraud and, people doing all kinds of things. I'd like to say, it's probably been around forever. But those of us of a certain age will remember back about 22, 23 years ago, drop a name on you, the Enron company, big, huge financial organization based out of New York and San Francisco and London and all that. They got into a world of problems because they were not really doing nothing more than a Ponzi scheme. If you're familiar, taking money from one investor and using those monies to pay off existing investors and make it look like their money is actually earning something when it's not. You're just using Peter to pay Paul, so to speak. They got caught. Long story short, they got caught. But there were people who blew the whistle on them. That's where the phrase came from, whistleblowers. Well, that's where they used it anyway and kind of coined the phrase. And what they were also doing was destroying financial records, and they were doing, destroying a lot of documentation, and they were also persecuting the people who, in one way or another, who had done the whistleblowing. So all of that came about. Some people went to prison over it. And what happened in this short story is legislation changed on a national level. You might have heard of it. One of the legislations that went into effect was called Sarbanes-Oxley, or commonly referred to SOX, S-O-X. The SOX legislation, Sarbanes-Oxley financial protection in place for any financial institution to protect the assets, to not destroy evidence, to not persecute people who, one way or another, tried to follow the righteous path, and they became whistleblowers. Anyway, those protections went into place. Even though TDAGs and tribal entities are not financial institutions per se, what happened is the regulations trickled down. All of those protections of the financial institution or new protocols went into effect, and the trickle-down effect is now much more concentration, much more issues on fraud and its twin sister, theft and misappropriation and control of data. All of those things are coming down. Now, all of those are an issue. We have to have mechanisms in place. That's what I mentioned before. Internal controls are to mitigate and to protect the program against fraud, against theft. And I don't know if I have it here on the screen. Here's just a list of different types of business-related fraud and theft. And you can imagine there's all kinds of things that, can overlap into what we're doing. And all of these as an aggregate, as a bundle, are being considered. But another one, do I have it here? There's the Sarbanes-Oxley, the SOX, known as the Corporate Responsibility Act that I was alluding to, a little bit more information on that. New rules for accounting, auditors, corporate officers, and that includes us, that includes recipients of federal funding across the board, that we have all these new financial protocols, the tightenings of generally accepted accounting practices, a lot of emphasis on accounting issues and financial responsibility. Down there at the bottom, it says that there's even new protocols coming out. One of the new uniform guidance regulation is on whistleblower protection, just as I was saying. But the one more slide, because one part I really want to talk about before I get into more on internal controls is what's called personally identifiable information. The acronym for it is P, capital P, capital I, PII. Personally identifiable information. It's existed in the uniform guidance for a couple of years now. It's getting a facelift. It's getting not more just a facelift. It's getting more teeth. They're tightening that up. There is, because of the cybersecurity issue across the board, because of data breaches across the board, all industries, because of theft, because of fraud, because of all this financial mismanagement at a corporate level, we're seeing more and more tightening. And what you're going to see now is an enhancement of the regulations in the uniform guidance, which means internal controls, pertaining to the identification of personally identifiable information. If you're not familiar with that phrase, please write it down, because it's becoming a burning issue across the board, especially for tribal entities, including TDAGs and housing departments. Personally identifiable information, I'll get into what that is in a second. And its counterpart, protection of PII, protection of personally identifiable information. What the regulations say is that every entity that uses federal funding, whether it's a housing or any other department or any other industry, needs to do a couple things. One, they need to identify what is personally identifiable information within their scope of operation. So if you're a TDAG, for example, you need to first identify what is personally identifiable information. It could be a variety of different things, right? It could be an individual who is a renter or a buyer or a client in one way or another. It could be their name. It could be their social security number. It could be their address, their marital status, their gender, their criminal record, if any, their passport number. And it also could include, these days, what's called biometrics. Biometrics are, you've seen them in every way, shape, and form. It could be a scan of your fingerprint. It could be a scan of your face. These days, it could be a scan of your eyes. If any of you travel like I do, I use a lot of Delta Airlines. Delta has what's called the CLEAR system, and that's a biometric system that scans your eye, your retina, and that's how they track you. It's more accurate than fingerprints. And it has all the information, my TSA number, all the things that I just rattled off before, my social security number, my address, my name, my gender, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So biometrics has to be considered part, or might be considered part of your personally identifiable information. You need to, first of all, in your policies and procedures, in your internal controls, identify what personally identifiable information is for your operation. Is it any of the things I mentioned previously? And once you start putting those two things together, for example, a name and an address and a social security number, and perhaps last year's income statement, because you want to have proof of income, now you're in the realm 4 times over of personally identifiable information. Second step, you're going to have to create policies and procedures to identify it and then to protect it. You have to protect not only hard copy documents that are in your scope of work and within your, literally within your office. You're going to have mechanisms in place, and its counterpart, electronic. One of the things we did at the Native Learning Centers, we created, or the tribe did, its IT department created a separate drive called the X drive, XYZ, the X drive, where the Native Learning Center put all of its confidential information, all of its electronic information. The hard copy versions were kept in, catch this, a locked filing cabinet in the office manager's office. So we're talking two different types of security, because we were at the time running both hard copy and scanning hard copy to create electronic versions. So we had to have discussions with the IT department on how to set up protocols to protect it. All right. Then the third level was who had access to the information, who had access to the hard copy. And on the electronic side, here's two levels there. Who had access to view the electronic documents, and at a higher level, who had the ability to change any of the documents, to add, to delete, to remove, to manipulate, who had that highest level. So all of those protocols, those compliance protocols, had to go in place within the realm, within that one area of personally identifiable information, which was all part of our internal controls and brought about by this whole issue of fraud and theft, and more recently, the burning issue of cyber threats and its counterpart, cybersecurity. I hope you follow me on that. It's getting more and more complicated, and more demands on us to have these conversations with our IT experts to make sure that as we move more and more towards a data-driven environment, which is what the OMB and the feds want us to do, more and more and more and more data-driven activity, then we need to have controls that are equally data protected. Does that make sense? Because we've got these security issues. And I'm not talking about the big issues. I'm not talking about active shooter, although that's a concern. I'm not talking about the bombing of facilities. I'm talking about the mundane day-to-day data stuff that we have, that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes we take for granted, right? Those are the things, those are the tripping hazards. These are the fundamental areas that need protection as much as the people who work in the facility need personal protection, right? And your facility itself needs to be protected. The documents we work and the information we collect, data, more and more data driven, also needs to be protected. Hope that makes sense. I cannot stress this more, because I'm seeing this more and more and more in these federal regulations, which are, as I said before, are difficult enough to try to navigate and interpret. And now we have these focus areas that we got to concentrate on. Questions for everyone as we move forward. Do you have any questions? There's the Sarbanes-Oxley. Before, as I keep moving on, such important stuff here, super important. Okay, internal controls, as this is what the discussion is today. Here's the reference to the actual uniform guidance, as I mentioned for a couple of times, 200-303, internal controls, not much there. I kind of paraphrase on the left, actually not paraphrase, it's coming right out of the regulation. It states that the non-federal entity, that's you, as the recipient of federal funds, sometimes called an NFE, must take reasonable measures. Write that phrase down, reasonable measures to safeguard financial and operational, and let's add in compliance information. compliance activities. That's the first thing it says. It also says something. The second one is on financial activities with the same amount of focus. Then the one that I was just talking about there, that second bullet on the bottom left, the non-federal entity must also take reasonable measures to safeguard personally identifiable information, which you determine. Don't look at the federal government to tell you what PII is. All they say is you've got to identify it, you've got to protect it. And if you don't, all hell to pay. If you don't, you've got to define it. Like I tried to, paint that picture, you have to define it, and then you've got to have solid policies in place that protect hard copy and electronic. You have to determine what is PII, personally identifiable information, based on your focus, your mission, your circle of influence, your day-to-day operation. On the right, this is an actual screenshot of my interpretation of the new guidelines coming out. This one says highlights of proposed changes to 2 CFR Part 200, subpart C. So I pulled out just a little snippet of information of proposed updates. That section is, remember I talked about D a moment ago, this is C, which is called the pre-federal award. Now, most of pre-federal award regulations or narrative on regulations pertains in this section to the agencies. But there is something buried in there called risk review. You can find it right now in 2 CFR Part 200.206. And basically, there are 3 areas you can see listed there, hopefully, 3 little bullets there, or asterisks. It says revises risk education by using the terms risk assessment as a standard term and clarifying agency recipients. So they're talking about the agencies using risk, the phrase risk and risk management more commonly, more prevalent in their day-to-day operation. So a focus on risk. Second asterisk clarifies that agency processes may consider any risk criteria pertinent to a program. Okay, giving the agencies a little more flexibility on their end to determine what is risk of the federal funding recipients, such as cybersecurity listed specifically, or impacts on local jobs and the community. Okay, focus. Allows agencies, federal agencies, to modify its risk assessment at any time during the cycle of the award. Good God, what that means is the federal agencies are getting carte blanche, they're getting more input from a higher level, in this case, Office of Management and Budget, who creates these federal guidelines, giving them more flexibility to fine-tune what they consider to be risk. So imagine if this is HUD and ONAP, and now they're being empowered at an agency level to fine-tune what they call risk. And every recipient of federal funding has a certain degree of risk, right? We all do. We all have risk. Now, the federal agencies are getting a little more control over that. What is risk and how do you determine it? They're getting more and more empowerment here. This is another clue that we're moving towards a more restrictive environment where risk is being calculated in almost everything that we do, from the audits. That's always been in the audit process. What is our level of risk from an audit standpoint, from financial activity? But now in day-to-day operation, even the risk factor is getting a closer look. Sorry, I think I jumped ahead here. I didn't mean to. My screen went black for 2 seconds and it jumped ahead a couple slides. I hope that makes sense. And at the very bottom in blue, there's that new one coming out on whistleblower protection. So got to take the good with the bad here, or in this case, the bad with the good. Okay, I talked about PII. There's a little definition. You can go to the uniform guidance, and you can go to 2 CFR Part 200.1, which is right at the very beginning. Those are the definitions, and you can look at the federal government's definition of what personally identifiable information is. They give some examples. but they don't tell you what to do. And then down below, a little bit more information there in the red box. So you can go to 2 CFR Part 200.1 to get more detail. It's not going to tell you what PII is exactly or how to deal with it. That's it. Okay. Any questions? I'm looking at the chat box. I see comments from Brooke and links, but I'm not seeing any questions from you. So I'm assuming you're with me and you're following me and everything's okay, because we're talking a lot of information here, a lot of repercussions. It's not just policies and procedures and internal controls at face value. We're talking about the potential here for the control of your program and the protection of your program. And this is not a laughable matter. This is very serious when you're using federal funds. You want to make sure that you are up to speed on everything. That's why in the web links in the center, bottom center, you've got a slew of different links there and guides to help you understand. The most important thing you can do before we move on to the next section is to consider this. The best advice that I can give you and the best leadership that I can give you is to learn how to navigate, learn how to interpret, and learn how to implement the federal regulations, specifically the uniform guidance, because that's the mother of federal regulations. It applies to all of us that receive federal funds, not just tribes and TDHEs, everyone. So we know that in some cases, the uniform guidance has some of the regulations are vaguely written. They don't tell you how to do it. They just say you have to do it, like PII. That's a perfect example. You've got to do it, but they don't tell you, here's step 1, step 2, step 3. Oh, no, you've got to have a command, an understanding of all the regulations at every level and know how to interpret them to be able to put together policies, internal controls, let alone the policies and procedures that had the exact verbiage. You've got to understand how to navigate, how to interpret, and how to implement those internal controls, those citations that are contained in the uniform guidance before you even start. That's what this program is really trying to accomplish in a very short period of time. 90 minutes is not enough time, people, to get all of these moving parts together. So hit me up after the presentation today, tomorrow, next week, next month, 6 months from now, whenever. Email's the best way to get a hold of me. We can talk about your internal controls on a one-to-one basis, because this is quite simply an overview. And even at the overview level, it's like taking a drink out of a fire hose, right? It's just too much and too much of a short period of time to really, I'll be honest with you, to really understand the magnitude of what you're trying to do here. This took me years, 10 years, 11 years, 11 plus years to really get a handle of it and master it. And as soon as you master it, they change it. They change the regulations. They update them. So it's a moving target in some regards, but at least we have a base to fall back on, a base test, a base level. Okay. Quick core. This is what we talked about. Resources, what are internal controls, compliance, and now next we're going to, with the time we have remaining 30 plus or minus minutes, to move into policies and procedures, which is where the rubber meets the road. The details. Quiz 1. Can internal controls provide reasonable assurance for protection? Answer: A, yes, for operation. B, yes, for financial activities. C, yes, for compliance. D, A and B only. Answer: E, B, and C only, or F, A, B, and C. What are your thoughts on that? Give me your best educated guess. Oh, there it is. Brooke has put it up as a quiz poll, quiz/poll. Give me your best shot at this. Minute. All right, take a look at it. It's important. Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Tina, for your answers there. Also, thank you, Cora. Thank you, Bliss, for taking a stab at it. All right, I don't want to waste too much time on it. Brooke, can we see? Can we go to the? Well, I have the answer on the next screen. I just want to see the results of the poll. We can. Okay, it looks like everyone is done now. Okay. You can take. Can I reduce that? Okay, thank you. Well, the answer is the last one there. Can internal controls provide for reasonable assurance? That's the important phrase, reasonable assurance. Those are the Fed's words of protection. Yes, for A, B, and C. That's the whole idea of putting it. Reasonable assurance. If nothing's guaranteed, that's why the Feds use the term reasonable assurance. That's why we should use the phrase reasonable assurance in our own policies and procedures and internal controls, right? We use their terms. So let's move into the next one. Let's take internal controls into active policies and procedures. Brooke, if you could throw up the next poll, if you don't mind, let's get an idea where we are with internal controls. Does your tribal organization have written policies and procedures that meet the requirements of your internal control system? Let's take just a few minutes to look at that. Okay. All right. Kind of like before, but a little bit more of the I think so. Oh, change it. Here we go. Almost a 50-50 split. Okay. Kind of like where we were before with internal controls. Thank you, Brooke. You can take that down now. Looks like we're about half and half, which is kind of where I expected. And some of you have looks like some of you have a good idea where you are with internal controls and your policies and procedures. And the other half are like, I'm not really sure. But in both cases, you're in the right place because if you are really solidly understanding your internal controls and policies and procedures, then this might act as a validation for you or reaffirm that you're moving in the right direction. Those of you that aren't sure, then you're going to be exposed to something new and hopefully informative and helpful. That's what I'm going to try to do in the time that we have remaining. Our agenda at the bottom here is similar to what we did before, but with a focus now on policies and procedures, which are the documents, the processes that helps us put our internal controls into motion. It's enough to have in your overall operation internal controls in the three areas of concern: operation, financial activities, and compliance. But the policies and procedures are where we actually boots on the ground. That's where we actually put things into motion. So that's what we're going to do with this overview. A couple of policies and procedures, got some resources here as well. And this first one is HUD's Policies and Procedures Guideline. I would suggest that you take a look at that. Let me get my phone up real quick and do a quick screenshot in real time and see. Hopefully it takes us where I want it to. Thank you, Brooke, for posting that. And on my phone, should be taking me to HUD. Just slow downloading. HUD Policies and Procedures. Yeah. Okay. Very good. That's a good resource, I think, to have. Gosh. All right. Then let's move on. Importance of policies and procedures. What are they? I kind of alluded to them. They are where the more detail. A policy is a clear, concise guiding principle adopted by an organization to maintain continuity for the organization in sync with its internal controls. The procedure is kind of like the difference between the policy and procedure. The procedures are kind of more like an owner's manual. If you can envision an owner's manual. For an owner's manual for a blender you might have in your kitchen, or for or for a lawnmower that you might have in your garage. They're written in two ways. Your procedures are written, both of them actually, are written in what's called technical writing, especially the procedures. They're written for speed, they're written for accuracy, and a lot of times they're written for safety. You know, step 1, step 2, step 3, don't put your hand inside the blender because you may slice off a finger. Same applies to a lawnmower. Do not touch the undercarriage. Make sure it's totally off. Those are safety issues, safety protocols. So time is of essence when we write policies and procedures. They're usually, after a short blurb of introduction, they usually are pretty concise and they match up with what's in our concerns of internal controls. They're usually technical examples of technical writing for the most part. So I want to make that clear. That's very, very important issue, the difference between narrative writing and technical writing when I talk to grant writers, because there's a difference between narrative writing, which is a slower paced storytelling, comprehensive type, more passionate type of style writing compared to technical writing, which is, you would think of architects and engineers and professional people. You know, it's written very concise, less words, less passionate, more direct, more safety oriented, more step and procedure oriented, thus its name. And a good example is technical writing, like an owner's manual. But this is where we put our protocols into place, and they have to match up with our internal controls that I told you. Internal controls are much broader. What are policies and procedures? Little walk-through kind of test here. What is a policy and procedure? All organizations should have policies and procedures. Well, yes, for two reasons, right? One, it's mandated by the internal controls, which is part of the uniform guidance, right? We talked about that earlier. So it's mandated. And secondly, it's a good business practice to have not just policies and procedures, but written policies and procedures. And by the way, it's probably going to be one of the first things that the program reviewer or the audit team is going to ask for when they come in to look at your program. Where are your policies and where are your internal controls? What are they? And where are your written policies and procedures? And the follow-up question would be, okay, you have them, I see them. Do you follow them? Are they up to date? So this is, this is the minutia that we have to deal with when it comes to policies and procedures. Two. Oh, here we go. What are policies and procedures should be written down? Yes, obviously. Mandated, and it's a good business practice, all of them. So if they're written down, hover here for a minute, they should also be subject to review, to monitoring, and for updating, correct? Absolutely. We should be able to, that's a very important compliance protocol, is to have the empowerment to be able to have access to policies and procedures, to at a minimum make recommendations if they're obsolete in one way, shape, or another. And the best case scenario would be to able to change policies and procedures because of an inefficiency or a finding or an inadequacy in operation. So that would be the best thing. So that's that. What are policy procedures? Most policies and procedures are written after something happens. Boy, isn't that true. A lot of times that's the case, right? Something happens. Hopefully it's not something terrible, either from a operational standpoint or a financial mistake, let alone a safety issue. Unfortunately, this is a true answer that most policies and procedures are developed and or written after something is discovered. And people come together and say, we should have a policy for that. Well, yeah, you probably do. You probably do need to have that. But you also need to be able to navigate, interpret, and implement the federal regulations so that you can troubleshoot and be proactive to make sure that your policies and procedures not only meet the existing mandated requirements, but also you're interpreting the regulations correctly, as was tried to demonstrate in the training so far, that you interpret the vague citations accurately and implement them properly with good internal controls and policies and procedures. So there's a lot of proactiveness involved here and a lot of hoping that you have the empowerment to be able to do this. So those of you that don't know what, if you have policies and procedures, let alone internal controls, now's the time to start asking and looking and making sure that you have them, you understand them, and that they're up to date, and that you have something to compare them to. You understand now a little bit better what the source is. And the source is your funding, whether it's Indian Housing Block Grant through HUD and ONAP or another agency. And your other authoritative source is going to be, at the highest level, is going to be the uniform guidance, the 2 CFR Part 200 regulations that clearly, in many cases, indicate you've got to have internal controls. And then if you know how to navigate, you find all these other things buried in it that tell you the certain things that have to be in place. The best way to be legally safe is to not write anything down. Well, try that. You probably destroy the program and probably your career, and might end up maybe even with civil penalties or maybe even jail time if you don't follow the legal protocols that are in place, dictated by the law and or regulations and even tribal policies and protocols. So written policies are important, super, super important. Anyone can write a good policy. Usually when I ask this question, I get half the group will say yes and half the group will say no. That's probably what you're thinking right now. Maybe yes, maybe no. I think with proper training programs like this, little one-on-one, I think anyone, even someone who's new to the program, can learn how to write policies once they have these other skill sets mastered: the navigation, interpretation, and implementation of being able to navigate through or understand the regulations that apply at all levels. Then I think, yeah, you can. Communicates the importance of policy, specifically communicates the values and more importantly, the expectations for how things are done within the organization according to their internal controls, keeps the organization in compliance and out of trouble with legislation, with its funding source, provides protection against employment claims, not just employment claims, but also federal agency claims that you're not doing processes correctly. You never want to have that hanging over you. Whoops, went too far. Documents and implements best practices that are appropriate for organizations. Try to give you some best practices when I think of it. Oh, one was doing the self-monitoring, which is part of internal controls, more than the requirements of annually. That's a best practice. Do it semi-annually or quarterly, the self-monitoring. The second one was the 3-year letter of the loan retention of financial of records, operational and financial records. I'm recommending more than that. A lot of tribes go way beyond 3 years and keep those are two best practice tips. Supports consistent treatment of staff. Compliance is all about consistency and fairness, right? Not just of staff, but also of operation, of vendors, of everything. It's having protocols in place, internal controls, and being consistent with them. Consistent application, just like we did as parents with our kids. If mom says something to the kids, dad better back it up, or vice versa, so that we're consistent in the application and the treatment, whether it's a reward system or not a reward system, a disciplinary system. We're all on the same page. We're all consistent with the application. And that's very, very important when it comes to vendors and when it comes to protocols for procurement, competition, etc. We need to treat everything the same way. And any exception to that has to be thoroughly documented, that we're stepping outside of our normal repetitive protocol process to do something that's unusual. Then we fall right back into our consistent compliance system. I hope that makes sense. That's very, very important when it comes from the compliance standpoint. Helps management make decisions. Yes, good internal controls, good policies and procedures theoretically will help the organization run more efficiently if they're implemented consistently and properly, which helps management make decisions for the betterment of the program, right? That should all be part of the process. Finding what self-monitoring does as part of your internal controls is help you find the challenges, the weak areas. It helps you to identify them prior to you having to submit something to the federal agency, your funding agency, that is anything less than pristine. That's what self-monitoring does. That's part of the compliance. That's part of internal controls. It helps management, and not just management, it helps the overall operation run more effectively and efficiently, hopefully. Protects individuals and the organization and the program. That's why we have internal controls, as I said early on, to protect the program and the positions within the organization. So internal controls, policies, and procedures play a very big part. They're just as important as the service that you're providing as a TDHE, as a housing department, or as anything else. Follow me? It's just as important. Very, very important to do it right. It's basically providing customer service for ourselves, to have to take this stuff seriously and make sure we have mechanisms in place. If we had time, we're already at the bottom of, pushing 90 minutes here. If we'd have time, we'd go into more specific examples of it. I'll try to move through this section quickly to spend just a minute, if I have it here, on particular issues. We know from a compliance standpoint that having internal controls and issues is a good thing. All the up arrows, that compliance, policies and procedures, internal controls has wonderful benefits to it. And also on the positive side, increases on all those things. It also mitigates or decreases exposure, inconsistency, expectations, resistance. So those are all good things too. Reduces the negatives. And you need in policies and procedures, internal controls, if you have a series of questions or repetitive questions primarily, high error rates could mean that your policies are not adequate or your people are not trained on the policies and procedures. Unacceptable mistakes, volumes of mistakes, unique interpretations, which is one of my favorite. If you don't have internal controls or policies and procedures that make sense, some people will take advantage of that and create their own interpretation of them, which is what we do not want to have. We want to have consistency in our understanding. All right, see if I have, well, I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit. I can always come back. Nope, I don't have it here, but that's okay. Quiz number 2. Is it true that the best ways for my organization to be legally safe is to not document any policies and procedures in writing? And there is the poll that just jumped up. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different operations: true, false, true, none, all of the above for your answers there. Take a guess, and then we'll close out by just spending a few minutes on policies, actual policies.
Hey, Vince, you actually have until 4 today, so feel free to take your time on the topics that you're wanting to explore more, because we had pushed together the 2 parts into one day, so you have until 4.
All right, thank you. Let's see if I have something in front of me that goes beyond the presentation. I'll have to go off script, as they say, to talk about some policies and procedures to have in place. All right, let's see where we ended up with this question. All right, let's see where we ended up. I'm going to talk a little bit more about a couple things here. That's some good stuff. All right, everyone's answered, and Thank you very much, Brooke. We can take that down and move forward. Is it true the best way for an organization to be legally safe is to not document any policies and procedures? Oh, no. False. Written policy should be documented in writing for every organizational process and activity with reasonable assurance, right? We're using the Fed's term, reasonable assurance. And my interpretation of what reasonable assurance means is to the best of our ability. That's the equivalent of the Fed saying with reasonable assurance. So what I would do is when you go about, there's the questions there, Tina. Yeah, I thought that too. They kind of covered up the questions, but there it is. Really, the answer is kind of self-evident there that you really should have written policies in place to the best of your ability. And that's what I'm talking about with reasonable assurance. What I was leading into is if you're getting to the point where you might have to rewrite policies and procedures as part of your internal controls, consider doing it this way. Just consider it. You want to start your policies and be consistent with your policies and procedures so that they sound like they're written by one person. You always want to be consistent with the verbiage. So what I would recommend that you do at the top is you want to always if you're a recipient of federal funds, like all of you are, you want to refer to that in the very first paragraph. That it's something to the effect of, in accordance with the federal regulations contained in the OMB's Uniform Guidance 2 CFR Part 200, this TDAG or this tribal entity or this nonprofit has implemented a series of internal controls that cover the areas of operation, financial activities, and compliance, period. There's your first sentence or sentence or two. Third sentence, with reasonable assurance, this TDAG has developed and put in place a series of internal controls and a series of policies and procedures, including the following policy on whatever it may be. For example, maybe it's on allowability of cost, what you consider to be allowable areas of cost. Another one would be confidentiality of information, probably one of the most important ones. A third one might be code of conduct. Another one could be nepotism, very prevalent in our industry, right? Nepotism. The next one could be on procurement. Now, in procurement, you're going to have the federal guidelines telling you the processes for sealed bids. It's also going to give you the guidelines for competitive procurement and also for what's called non-competitive or sole source procurement. You've got those federal guidelines that you can state. And then if the tribe has any protocols that are more restrictive, that's where you would put them. And if your TDAG has protocols that are even more restrictive, that's where you would put them. This is what we did at the Native Learning Center. We had a very comprehensive policy on procurement. I started it the same way I told you with referencing the uniform guidance. Then I went into the federal regulations. The uniform guidance 2 CFR says this about procurement, sealed bid, competitive, sole source. And then the tribe has these protocols and thresholds for approval. And then the Native Learning Center at the lowest, but certainly not the lowest level, but the most restrictive, has procurement policies that supersede all of the above in these areas. And I would list that. So we've got in that particular area policies and procedures for procurement. We had 3 different levels of procurement citations or regulations to follow: the uniform guidance, then the tribe, then the department. Or you might even have a 4th level if you had a federal agency in there, like HUD, for example, or some of the other funding agencies also might have some protocols that you might have to, and they would squeeze in between the federal regulations, the uniform guidance at the top, and probably the tribal regulations. So you'd have potentially four different levels of procurement protocols to put in place. They might not overlap because they might be talking about different things. In my example, the tribe had protocols on authorization levels, where we had to go for a certain dollar amount, it had to go to the legal department for authorization. If it exceeded that amount, it had to go to the corporate tribal treasurer for his or her approval. See what I mean? So that was more approval driven, where on a tribal level, where when it finally came down to the Native Learning Center, again, it contained approval levels, but it also had protocols built in on the process. The Native Learning Center's process for procurement, where bids were to be accumulated either through email or hard copy or online or through websites, however, documented in each case, 3 bids where we could get them. 3 bids every single time for everything. Even if we were buying paper clips for the office, we would go through. They were usually things like that were usually lumped together into what was called an office supply procurement. But you see what I mean? There was no difference in the procurement process, regardless of what the procurement was. There was no difference. We treated every procurement the same. Again, here's the consistency coming through. The process remains the same. So any exception to that would be very, very, very unique, and it would be documented as such. This is, we stepped outside of our normal protocol because we could not find 3 vendors to provide a bid for a particular product that we wanted to get. I have an example of that. We used to have a big 10-foot by 10-foot display that we would bring to events and set it up. It was like an accordion type thing that we would set it up, pull it apart, and it would be 10 feet tall, 10 feet wide, and about 1.5 feet deep. And the back of it just looked like a skeleton type thing. But there were little brackets in there. I don't want to go to the thank you yet. There were little brackets in there that held it in place. And once you opened it up, you'd snap those brackets together. And then occasionally, because they were plastic, they would break. Now, there's only a few places that would make these type of signs. So our choice was limited because of the product that was being sold. So we would step outside of our normal competitive procurement process and go to what we call non-competitive. Well, that's what the feds call it, non-competitive. It's also called sole source. And we would do that. So we would have a policy of procurement. We would explain, I would approach it the way I told you, with the different, starting with, according to federal guidelines, 2 CFR Part 200, with reasonable assurance, this is what we do for all of our the procurement, and then list the 3 or 4 or 5, depending upon how many levels of restriction, and then also explain in the policy the potential for any unusual activity, like the sole source. In other words, the policy would say, on a needs basis, on a case-by-case basis, the Native Learning Center will deviate from its normal procurement process to use a sole source process. This process will only be used if a certain amount of vendors are not readily available, or for some other reason are not accepted, including quality of service and promptness in delivery. You ever have vendors that provide a good product, but they're never on time? Or do you have vendors that just notoriously have a poor product? And do you have vendors sometimes that are both, Just because they give the lowest bid does not mean you have to accept them for those reasons. So you want to say that, we have this protocol, we're going to do this, we're usually going to do a competitive process on a case-to-case basis. We will use a sealed bid process. That's rare, very rare in our case. And also equally rare will be the sole source. And we will, and by and large, we will use competitive bidding. And also from time to time, we will make the hard decision to not use the lowest bid based on a case-by-case basis, based on quality of product and timeliness of delivery and other factors that revolve around quality. You don't have to accept the lowest bid if the quality of the product sucks, basically. And you don't want to put your organization in that. So you need to have a disclaimer in your policy, probably in your procurement, that gives you that flexibility. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing. All right. So let's walk through, go back right here. Let's go back and I want to talk about the updates. So give you a little bit of heads up about these updates to the uniform guidance come out and see if I can shed any light on it. Keep in mind, take some notes here because this is important. The uniform guidance, which is our go-to regulation, right, for all federal funding, regardless of what we are, TDHE, tribal entity, nonprofit, institution of higher learning, medical facility. You could also be a church. You could be all kinds of different things and still receive federal funding. As it relates, we're focusing on TDHEs and tribal entities that receive federal funding. The uniform guidance is our go-to. It's kind of the master regulation, right? We've established that. It is made up of 6 parts. I mentioned that. Subpart A, B, C, D, E, and F. A, B, and C primarily, subparts A, B, and C primarily relate to the agency and the federal agency and its requirements that it must maintain, and also its requirements and how it deals with us as recipients. So just to go over, I want to go over a few things that might be changing in the uniform guidance, whether they're good or bad, within each of the sections, A, B, and C. And then I'll talk a little bit to close out about D, E, and F, subparts D, E, and F, which are more geared towards the recipient. That would be us. And any changes in there. So let me walk through this. I have a document here in front of me, which I can send to you. If you wish, just send me an email. All right. In subpart A of the uniform guidance, federal guidelines is referred to as the definitions. It's just simply called 2 CFR Part 200.1. And there are probably 70 different definitions in there. You need to get familiar with the semantics, with the terminology and the phraseology in there. So you know what a non-federal entity is, NFE. So you know what equipment means. So you know what a supply means. So you know what written prior approval means. For example, those are just 4 different phrases in words that you recognize them, but you don't know, maybe you don't know what the interpretation is. You don't know how the feds look at that. So in subpart A, the major thing that they're talking about that I identified is they're removing 2 of these things. I think are in our behalf. They're removing what's called a lot of the conditions for written prior approval. If you go to the uniform guidance right now and you look up written prior approval, which means you got to go for TDHEs, you've got to go to your ONAP office and ask for approval for certain things. There must be 20 things listed there. They're talking about eliminating half of them, which is great. I think that gives the tribes and the recipients much more flexibility if they remove a bulk of what is now prior approval requirements. So mark that one down, circle, or make a note, prior approvals being reduced. The number and the severity of them. Another one in there is, you'll see it, matching/cost sharing. You see this all the time, and it's usually listed just like that, matching or cost sharing and matching. What they're going to do is they're going to remove the word matching. I know, it seems like a very small change, but it's trying to eliminate some confusion. What you're going to see is the phrase going forward, cost sharing. That's just going to be the phrase that they're going to use for funding. It could be anywhere from 5% to 50%. They're trying to eliminate some confusion there. Okay. The big one, 3 big ones in there, and that is all of them in the dollar amount thresholds. They're talking about, if you're familiar with this, just bear with me. If you're not, please know that equipment and supplies, just to name 2 of them, have one of their criteria is a dollar threshold. Currently, it's the number $5,000. You may want to write that down. Equipment, $5,000. Supply, $5,000. It's like a benchmark. It's one of the ways that the federal government separate the difference between a supply, which is got a shelf life, a supply, it's consumable. They look at it like a consumable product, a supply. $5,000 currently or less is one of the indicators of a supply. And equipment, same thing, $5,000 or more, and a life expectancy longer than a supply categorizes it more as equipment. Equipment is more difficult to deal with because we have perhaps depreciation in it. The value tends to be much higher. They're talking about increasing the threshold from 5,000 for both of those to 10,000. Make that note. Right now, currently, supply 5,000, equipment 5,000. Now they're talking about making the threshold 10,000 for both of them, which I think also is a benefit. Now things $9,999 can be considered a supply if we're looking at it purely from a financial standpoint. Another potential threshold rising is the trigger amount, the dollar threshold to trigger what's called a single audit. So I got a lot of things in this particular story here. Look up the phrase single audit in the definition so you understand the difference between a regular audit and what's called a single audit, which is used for specifically for recipients of federal funding currently receiving $750,000 or more. Currently, that's the current threshold, $750K or more in the program year of federal funding would trigger what's called the requirement for a single audit. They are talking about increasing that threshold to 1 million. So make that note. It's not approved. It's talk right now. It's part of the proposed change. So I don't want you to write that one down in ink, but it's along with equipment and supplies and the matching and the prior approval. Those are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 areas they're talking about either increasing or eliminating. Okay, that's in the definition, subpart A. Subpart B, I have nothing to share with you there. Nothing that would affect us in any way, shape, or form. It's all at an agency level. Subpart C, let me talk about that a little bit because there's 1, 2, 3, 4 sections in there, mostly on the agency side, but have some overlap into what we do. Subpart C of the uniform guidance is called the pre-federal award requirements. That area is mostly geared, again, for the agency. But there's a couple areas that have trickle-down effects on us. So 2 CFR Part 200-201, that's within Subpart C. It's called Use of Grant Agreements, 200.201. And they're talking about 2 areas in here that might change. One, adding additional certifications to address potential risk of fraud. There it is. Okay. So federal agencies are going to get more emphasis put on them again to identify potential areas of risk related to fraud, which means we'll be the recipients of that scrutiny. Okay, that's coming to them. Another one more specifically identifies certain prior approval requirements. I mentioned that before. So that's kind of where it lives in 200.201. All right, use of program agreements. All right, 200.202, program planning. Is there anything in there? Let me read it real quick. No, that's more, again, that's more agency. 244. Again, in subpart C, 200.204, notices of funding opportunities, referred to as NOFOs. This is more on notices coming out, being put out on grants.gov, another repository. I think it's good for us. This one, there's going to be more focus on plain language in the notices of funding opportunity. That's a great thing. You ever look at those notices? It's like 27 people wrote them using different languages, and the way that they're put together, it's most of the time very, very difficult to understand them. So I'm glad they're moving in that direction. That's a benefit for us as potential recipients of more federal funding. There we go. Sorry about that. And the other focus is they're moving towards, with these new funding notices, another one focusing on underserved communities. To be consistent and transparent, this attempts to ensure that applicants are not unintentionally excluded from funding opportunities. Well, that's great, because a lot of the tribal entities that try to apply for these are small. They don't have the resources to hire a grant writer or have the expertise. So that's great. All right, 200.206, risk. We're back to risk review. They're looking at, let me read it to you, clarifies that federal agencies possess processes may consider any risk criteria pertinent to the program, such as cybersecurity risk or impacts on local jobs in the community. Well, the one that stands out is cybersecurity. More tightening of the screws on what we've just been talking about for the past 90 minutes. Fraud, risk, and measures of that more and more. All right. Another one is 200.216, prohibition on telecommunications. Look, this one. This is a Trump administration carryover. This is the moratorium on purchases of audiovisual and telecommunication products and services from Chinese companies. This was a panic attack that carried over. I'm surprised it's still there. If anything, they're tightening it up, believe it or not. You're not supposed to purchase any products that are made by certain Chinese companies, and you can actually go to the regulations and you can look up the companies and find out which Chinese companies they're talking about. So this would include audiovisual equipment, projectors, microphones, lavalier mics, but also include surveillance equipment and service contracts for certain surveillance equipment that you may have for your building, for your parking lot, for your staff. The low voltage cabling that comes with it, all of those products and services you're not supposed to purchase from 6 or 7 Chinese companies. So that's all I can say on that. Okay. D gets a D, E, and F. Some parts D, E, and F. On the last few minutes we have, I want to talk about them briefly. That's where the bulk of the changes are. Those are the areas that affect us. And this is where I suggest that you do 2 things. First, get comfortable with the regulations they are now, what we spent the first 90 minutes on, right? Making sure you understand the current uniform guidance and your internal controls and policies and procedures that are supposed to match up with the current uniform guidance. Once you've done that, then you can start looking at these updates. They won't make sense to you if you just delve right into the updates. You've got to have a base knowledge of what exists now before you can make comparisons for what's going to happen, like the equipment, raising the threshold from 5,000 to 10,000 for both equipment and supplies. One of the other that I think is a benefit for us is in the subpart D is 2 CFR Part 200-317, procurement. This one, and I hope this happens, this is in our favor as recipients, allows tribes to follow their own policies and procedures. It's just a few words there, but you know what that means? That means, theoretically anyway, before the final words come out, that if this happens, if this particular statement happens, we would, as federal funding recipients, we would be able to adjust our procurement based more on tribal protocols than on federal requirements, which is good, I think. So if you're familiar with your protocols for your procurement and you know what it says in the uniform guidance about sealed bids and about competitive and about the sole source, what their requirements are, this is saying you might be able to circumvent that and go strictly with tribal policies, which would be wonderful. So that's, keep an eye on that. 2 CFR Part 203.317, procurement. Right? Hopefully good news in the next 60 or 90 days on that one. Another one, 2 CFR in the same vein, 200.319. Mark this one down. Competition. You got to know what it says right now about competition. You got to have competition. That's what it says in the federal guidelines, but it's more specific. Now here, what they're saying, listen to this, that it allows for a scoring mechanism that you would put in place, a scoring mechanism that rewards bidders committing to specific numbers and types of U.S. jobs and certain compensation and benefits. So what does that mean? Let me give you an example. When you do a sealed bid, you're trying to recruit or solicit a general contractor to do work on housing, right? You don't have it, you can't do it internally, you got to outsource this. You're going to have to hire a general contractor who in turn hires subcontractors, carpenters, plumbers, sheet metal mechanics, roofers, et cetera, et cetera. You use a sealed bid process to do that. Part of the sealed bid process is you rank you create your own internal ranking system, which you share with everyone. That's open competitiveness. You tell them, this is how we're going to rank you and give you points in the sealed bid process that total up to, let's say, a 100. For example, your experience working with tribes in the past might give you extra points. You're tribally owned, or you're a tribal Native American owned, you might get extra points for that if they can prove it. This says, moving forward, potentially allows for the scoring mechanism that rewards bidders committing to specific numbers and types of jobs and certain compensation. So you might be able to say to them, or they might be able to say to you, I don't think you can dictate to them, but if they say to you, or you encourage them to pay higher rates for their laborers or for their apprentices, or across the board for all of their journey level people, if they can prove that they pay higher rates, even at perhaps a union rate as opposed to a merit shop rate, then they would score higher. You'd be able to add that. That's new territory, which helps us in our selection process, our sealed bid process, and giving more points to award potential contractors or anyone that you're soliciting through a sealed bid process. It also could be architects and engineers, and GCs as well. So that's cool. That's very, very cool. Another thing in 2 CFR Part 200, the very next one, 320, methods of procurement. They're talking about, again, for sealed bids. Let's focus on sealed bids right now. In 320, it's talking about removing requirements for tribes to open the sealed bids in public. Now, you have to understand that the current regulation says for anyone receiving federal funding, for anyone, including tribes, TDHEs, that if you're going to do a sealed bid, part of the mandated requirement is that you collect the sealed bids, that's why they're called sealed, and that you open them all up at the same time and record in a public environment, and then record the dollar amount of the bid and any other criteria. And you're supposed to do that in a quote unquote public arena, or they don't use the word arena, in public. Now what they're saying is tribes and tribes only can open sealed, do not have to have that requirement. So you can do it on tribal property, on the rest, anywhere you choose. That's a wonderful, I think, benefit. You don't have to get a big group of the public, quote unquote, involved. You can make it exclusive if you want. I hope that transpires. I hope that turns into real. All right, another one. Make a note on this one. Here we're taking, remember, the emphasis on data. Uniform Guidance 200.329. This is on monitoring, self-monitoring, and reporting. That both of them are requirements. It says new language, and I don't know exactly what the language is. New language that emphasizes the importance of, quote unquote, measuring the customer's experience. That is new. That phraseology, that sounds like retail. That's, the hotel industry, where they constantly measuring your satisfaction, right? Always while you're there and after the fact. Do our survey. Tell us if we did well. Rank us, on your experience. This is very interesting, and it kind of sounds on the surface like a conflict, because we're moving more and more towards data collection, right? Which is all about the numbers. And now they're saying they're going to measure. If you're going to measure it, then you're going to have data, customer experience. So you're going to circle this, mark this down, because you're going to have to find ways to measure the satisfaction of your clients. That's what it's saying. If they're going to do this, new language that emphasizes the importance of measuring customer experience. Good God. How are you going to do that if you're not doing it already? You're going to have to be creative and figure out ways to measure the satisfaction of what you're doing of your clients from a data standpoint. Surveys, pre and post surveys, more than ever before, perhaps. That maybe you do that right now, but that's going to be, looks like we're moving in that direction. So be prepared for that potentially to materialize, so that you're going to have to work on measurements, mechanisms to measure satisfaction levels. And that's going to have to be probably dumped into your reporting throughout. I don't know how yet. I don't know what that means yet. It's still too new. That's going to have to be carved out by people smarter than me. I have no idea. So that's it for part C. Two more and we'll be done. We'll go through these quick. Part E is second to the last section of the uniform guidance. Subpart E is referred to the cost principles. Basically, what's allowable and what's unallowable as a cost. You need to get familiar with this. You got to know where you're spending your money and if it's allowable currently, or if people are talking about doing certain things or starting new programs, and you got to be able to put your compliance hat on and say, no, you cannot spend federal funds that way. You cannot use federal dollars to influence legislation, for example. You cannot do it. That means tribal elections. You cannot use federal funds to influence or pay for anything related to legislation or lobbying. That's a big no-no. All right, so that's not one of the changes, but that's, you've got to know what you can and what you can't do. The one thing that stands out in here is prior written approval. Talked about that earlier. Mark that one down, circle it. Removes 10 out of 15 prior approval requirements from the list, including equipment, real property, direct cost, exchange rates. So if you have vendors in Canada, for example, if you're Aquanazi up in upstate New York and you overlap into can't have the reservations, have in the States, have in Canada, exchange rates, the Canadian dollar. So that's it for that one. Prior written approval, 10 of them. Okay, that's the big one. Okay, conference, nothing there. All right, I guess that's it for that area. Nothing major. That the cost, nothing much changes there, except prior written approval is going away. The last section is F, and I'll leave you with this to finish up. I know we're at the top of the hour now. Give me just a couple minutes to enlighten you on a couple things here because they're important. One of them, subpart F, is audit requirements. This is the last one, and it's very, very important. You need to understand what your obligations are, what the auditor's obligations are. And that's all explained in subpart F, what I call the 500s. 501 is audit requirements. It raises the audit threshold from 750,000 to $1 million. I talked about that a little earlier. Mark that one down. That's a potential change. Don't ask me why right now. My educated guess is a couple reasons. One, generally don't have the human resource power to do all the audits they want to do these days, so they have to raise the threshold. And secondly, maybe they do believe in the theory that they want to make it a little bit easier for smaller tribes and to be able to survive this program, so they're raising the threshold. But that's 200-501. Scope of the audit, 200-514. Scope of audit. Revise, I don't know what they are yet. This could be significant. Revises compliance requirements to include a test. The word test is what the auditors use. They come in to test your policies and procedures, to test your internal controls, to make sure that they're done properly. That's the phrase they use, test or testing. So what this says is scope of audit, 514, revises compliance to include, quote unquote, a test of transactions and other audit procedures necessary to provide the auditor with sufficient evidence to support opinion on risk. There you go again. Well, from a different perspective. It's like in every section. This time they're talking about the auditors and the program reviewers coming in and making sure to identify your risk potential, high risk, low risk. So you need to know what are those triggers. Is it, and there are certain triggers. So listen to this. There's certain risk triggers you need to be aware of. One of them is it's a prior finding in an audit or program review. That's an automatic trigger to make you considered high risk. The second one is the financial amount that we talked about, $750,000 now, and or could be $1 million. If you're over that amount, considerably over that amount, you're in the, let's say, $3 million, $4 million, $5 million range, you're also considered high risk at that because of the dollar value. Keep in mind that we're, as tribes, we're at the low end of the recipient of dollar amounts. You got to remember that uniform guidance also pertains to the Department of Defense and other government agencies that receive billions of dollars. So when you look at this regulation and go, God, even at $1 million, we're at the low end. But yeah, that's true. But we still pose a risk. And you've got to understand, even at the low dollar amount, there's other risk factors that the auditors and that the funders will look at. Prior findings from prior audits and program reviews is an automatic see the principal, automatic trigger to go to the principal's office to be considered a high-risk student. So that's built in. And okay, so dollar amount, prior findings, any mismanagement issues that have been reported perhaps in the prior program reviews, or of all things, complaints that are sent to the EWONAP office on your, on behalf, not on behalf of you, but because of you, those kind of things manage to find their way to the audits. And, so that could be a tripping hazard. So mark this down. More high, across the board, we've got more risk areas and fraud and cybersecurity and data driven. All those are the big phrases and the big targets as we move not into just the next year, but subsequent years. Audit findings is the last one, 200-516. It's called audit findings. Revises the definition of what they call a known questionable cost. Okay, that's an auditor term. That's part of what they're trying to do when they come in and look for findings. They're looking for when it comes to what you spend your money on, your expenditures, your costs, your procurement. Anything that falls outside of the realm could be considered what they call questionable. And it's just that, questionable. Hopefully it doesn't elevate into something more serious. We could have a whole conversation about prepping for audits, and we probably should. It's something that I think the Native Learning Center should consider having as a training program, because it's an animal all in itself, preparing. Not that you would have to become an expert in financial transactions or CPA or an accountant or anything, but it's more audit from an operational standpoint and how to deal with the auditors coming in from an operational and for compliance. There, of course, there's going to be some overlap into financial activities because that's part of the three biggies, right? Operation, finance, and compliance. But we need a class just on that to talk about how to prepare, because what we're talking about today would overlap into it: internal controls, self-monitoring, prepping for the audit, and the backside of it, how to deal with findings, how to deal with the worst case scenarios, how to deal with findings that get elevated into something more serious. How do you handle those situations to protect the program or to mitigate from the beginning, so you don't get into that kind of a situation, right? That could be the next step for what we're doing here. All right. I think we have covered just about everything. This is a drink out of a fire hose for sure. There is a lot of information. That's why I'm saying, please reach out after the fact if you need to Brooke or to myself directly. I would prefer if you go through the Native Learning Center, go through Brooke and that, or OISTA or anyone there, so we have a trail of things. I don't want to leave Native Learning Center out of the loop, but I'm here to help, to troubleshoot, to help you with not only internal controls, but to understand, to navigate, to interpret, and to implement the uniform guidance and all the regulations that you need to have in place to protect yourself, protect your colleagues, protect the program, protect the tribe, prepare for audits, be your best, live your best life in this program, and make something out of this and protect the program and thrive. That's what I'm here for. That's what I like to do. And email's the best way to get a hold of me. So I talked a lot. Brooke, I'm going to turn it back over to you to close out. Thank you, everyone, for back to you.
All right, Vince, thank you so much. That was a beast of a presentation, and we so appreciate you doing 2 hours on it. I know you could go on all day about this stuff, but I really think you did cover a lot of it. I know I learned a lot listening. I launched the survey for you folks a couple of minutes ago, and I did launch it again just now. So please take a moment to complete it. If you fill this out, it just takes a minute or so, and it gives us feedback that we need about how to keep the good things going about our webinars, how to maybe tweak the things that need it. Feel free to be as candid as you like, because they are anonymous. But I know that Vince is one of our trainers. He definitely looks over the feedback. He applies it. So, he invites those comments, and so do we. We hope you can join us for our next webinar coming up on October 27th. That is this Friday. This will be a grant writing webinar. Just give us the money already. And this will be presented by Rosa McNally. This is another issue in our Fridays with Rosa series. Registration is always free. Feel free to access this and any other recorded webinars online on our website, nativelearningcenter.com. We have a Cathedra Webinars tab featuring a recorded webinars section, and you can click on any one of the webinars that we've done for the past 2 years. So feel free to visit those, share them with your friends, share them with your colleagues. And please also check out our upcoming events posted to our various social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. We even have a podcast titled Hopathanga Native American Podcast, where we discuss more focused topics within tribal housing and self-determination. You can listen on Simplecast, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, as well as viewing the video recordings with our guests on YouTube. All right, folks, once again, I want to thank all of our participants for joining us today. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and we hope to connect with you guys real soon. And I encourage you to join our weekly newsletter on our email list. We just put it out for the first time this Monday, and it is pretty good, if I do say so myself. We have a new graphic designer, and she is just absolutely brilliant. She creates the most beautiful things, and I hope you enjoy them as much as we do. All right, folks, I'm going to go ahead and close out the webinar. Everybody take care.